Thank you very much for that introduction, and it is a great pleasure to join you here tonight to have a discussion. I'm going to talk, but afterwards there's going to be opportunity for you to give your point of view. So let's make it a dialogue rather than me just talking. So if you've got any questions, criticisms, alternative points of view, we welcome them in the Q&A afterwards. I want to thank Plymouth Humanists and all of you for coming tonight and pay tribute to the human rights work of humanists in Britain and around the world. Humanists stand for human rights, for the well-being and welfare of human beings, against all prejudice, against all discrimination. And I've had the great pleasure of working in recent years with the Ugandan Humanist Association. In Uganda, there is a very, very strong Christian and Muslim fundamentalist lobby. The humanists in Uganda have played a really important, valued role in challenging religious superstition, but in particular, challenging the abuses, the human rights abuses that are orchestrated and promoted by religious fundamentalists. And one of the great projects they have in Uganda is the creation of humanist schools, where young people are not indoctrinated into religion or superstition, where social phenomena like witchcraft and witch hunting is challenged, and where young people are given a grounded understanding of different belief systems. Excuse me. So these Ugandan humanist schools play a very important role in creating a new generation of young Ugandan people who have an open mind, who listen to evidence and reason, who are not based upon superstition and dogma. So I'm really honoured to work with those humanists, not just in Uganda, but also Nigeria and many other countries who are in the forefront of the battle for equal human rights for everyone. As you know, tonight's talk has been titled "Organised Religion is the Greatest Global Threat to Human Rights." That, of course, is a very controversial claim, because arguably you could say there are many different, perhaps equally as threatening menaces to human rights as organised religion. So you might say, for example, that free market capitalism is a great, if not the greatest, global threat to human rights. Here I am drinking a glass of water. It tastes fine, it won't harm me. This morning and every morning, over 800 million people will wake up on this planet with no safe, clean drinking water. 1,000 million plus are hungry or malnourished. 1,500 million plus live in squalid shanty towns and shacks with no clean water, no electricity. Yet we live in a world of immense wealth. The 85 richest individuals in the world have a combined personal wealth that is equal to the total wealth of the 50% poorest people on this planet. Their personal individual wealth is as great as half the human population. Now that to me is grossly unfair. And of course, the denial of clean water, adequate food, healthcare, education, that too is an abuse of human rights. Human rights is not just about, freedom of belief or the right to protest. In international human rights conventions, it's enshrined that having the basic necessities of life is also a human right. It's written into the United Nations Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So I make that point just to counter the title of tonight's talk, that it is debatable what is the greatest global threat to human rights. And I certainly think that free market capitalism, the way the global economic system is organized to give a handful of people fabulous, extraordinary wealth, while billions live in poverty and, in many cases, are on the verge of dying because they don't have the basics. But back to my point. I think that it is certainly arguable that organized religion is the single greatest threat to human rights globally, particularly when it comes to the human rights of women, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people, and to the rights of religious minorities and non-believers. Just this last weekend, I was at the International Secular Conference in London, where we heard the testimony of mostly women from developing countries who had been victims of religious persecution because they did not fit and conform to the model of how a woman should behave. They didn't dress appropriately. They weren't sufficiently subservient to their husbands or to their local religious leaders. There was a roll call of people murdered by religious fanatics, people for expressing criticisms or doubts about religion, heroic human rights defenders who defended, in Pakistan, for example, people accused of blasphemy, and themselves ended up being killed. So, organized religion, that is the institution, the established religions, the religious leaderships in so many countries are culpable, directly responsible for many, many human rights abuses. Religion, I think we can all probably agree, has a long tradition of laws and values which enshrine patriarchy and heterosexism. And when it comes to issues of human rights, it is the issues of gender and sexuality which so often are the lightning rod, and the issues on which religious organizations fail the test of human rights. And I'm not just talking about countries far away, we're talking about religious organizations in our own country as well. Now, you may have noticed that this talk is all about the role of organized religion. So I'm talking about faith organizations, faith establishments, faith hierarchies, and faith leaders. I say that because I think we need to be careful not to lump all people of faith in the box that is religious fundamentalism and extremism. There are many individual good people of faith who do support human rights, and I salute them. In my own human rights work, I'm inspired by people who have taken much of their motivation from faith. Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker in the United States, Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan, the great anti-war activists in the United States in the 1960s against the Vietnam War, who broke into draft offices and destroyed records in protest at that unjust, immoral war. So my point is that there are good people in all faiths and of no faith. But when you come down to the crunch, it's the institutional, organized religion which is the really big problem. That's where power resides and where power is often wielded to deny people human rights. if we take a look at the role of organized religion around the world, we can see that in many, many, many countries, and probably in all countries, its role has been negative in terms of human rights. I'm sure you're all aware in the last few days, the new Vatican statement that's come out, which has proclaimed that, gay and lesbian people can be good, valued members of the community, and even that Christians should listen to the insights, experiences, and feelings of LGBT people. Well, I would say that change in tone is very welcome. It makes a very clear break with what we heard under Pope Paul II and Pope Benedict. I welcome it. But it is, I think, more of a change in style and tone than in substance. The Church's policies have not changed towards women, towards gay people, towards embryonic stem cell research, towards fertility treatment for childless couples, towards contraception. The Church's policy remains the same. The Catechism, for example, which is binding on all Catholics around the world, still talks in very intemperate language against gay people, calling them intrinsically disordered. So the change in tone is welcome, but there's not yet a change in policy. Maybe this is the beginning. Maybe we are going to end up with a new Catholic Reformation. Maybe. But in the circumstances where we are, the new space, the new change of tone, however small it may seem to be in practical effect, ought to be welcomed. It shows that the challenge to the Catholic Church from without and from grassroots members within is having an impact. The Vatican realizes it cannot sustain the old ideology, the old tenor and tone of condemnation and denunciation. And that's a victory for all of us who strive for human rights. And I would pay tribute to the We Are Church movement of grassroots Catholics who have been part of this process of challenging the Vatican and successive popes. They too are on the right side. We may not agree with their superstition and their dogma, but in terms of practical effect, which I think is the most important thing by which we judge people, they are on the right side because they want a church that is inclusive and that respects equality, diversity, and human rights. Anyway, if we look around the world, today at the role of organized religion, it's pretty clear. If we take Christianity, in the United States, it is Christian extremists and fundamentalists who are leading the fight against a woman's right to choose abortion, against same-sex marriage, against effective sex education in schools, and the provision of condoms to prevent the spread of HIV. In Nigeria, it's the Christian churches that are caught up in the hysteria around so-called witchcraft, the denunciation of women and even young children as witches possessed by demons, often subjected to extreme and brutal physical and mental assault. In Nigeria, again, it is the Christian churches that have spearheaded the new anti-gay legislation that was brought in earlier this year, which dramatically intensifies the repression of LGBT people, including a ban on gay organizations and events and a ban on advocacy of gay and lesbian equal human rights. I think you're all familiar in Uganda. The anti-homosexuality bill, again, was promoted, encouraged, and pushed forward by the Christian churches with the aid of right-wing evangelicals from the United States, like Scott Lively. Now, although that bill has been annulled by the Constitutional Court, it was annulled on the technicality that there wasn't a quorum when it was passed by the Parliament. So the principle of the bill has not been annulled, and the promoters of the bill are vowing that they will bring it back. And I'm fairly certain they will. And in virtually every single case, the people pushing for this bill, which at one point did include the death penalty for same-sex acts, I'm confident, or disappointed actually, that they will be bringing this bill back. In Russia, the religious backing for President Putin's tyranny is helping sustain his government's repression. Not just against LGBT people with the new anti-gay law from last year, but also, of course, the increasing restrictions on all civil liberties. The Russian Orthodox Church has made a pact with Putin, and he has made a pact with them. They now have incredible influence over Kremlin policy, and in return the Kremlin kowtows to those religious leaders. But these issues are not, of course, confined to Christianity. If we look at Judaism, we see that until recently, Jewish extremists had campaigned to prevent women from praying at the Wailing Wall. Jewish women had to fight for that right against Orthodox Judaists, who tried and for a long time did successfully stop them. Again, I'm not an advocate of praying at the Wailing Wall, but people have a right to do that. If you respect diversity and believe in democracy and human rights for all, that must include the right of people to pray, and particularly the right of women to pray at a place which is particularly sacred to the Jewish faith. I would say that, without much doubt, it is Jewish fundamentalists that have been instrumental in blocking the peace process with the Palestinians. They have orchestrated the new settlements on the West Bank, which have undermined the peace process, which are increasingly driving Palestinians into the arms of ever more extreme Palestinian factions. And of course, for many years, the same Judaist extremists sought to ban gay pride parades and events, and indeed in some instances did succeed in preventing them taking place some years ago. If we look at Hinduism, there is the rise of the Hindu religious right, where these Hindu nationalists have been and still are promoting an anti-Muslim, anti-Christian agenda, as well as attacking humanists, atheists, and other non-believers. Those Hindu nationalists are deeply implicated, in particular, in the notorious massacre of Muslim people some years ago. When it comes to Islam, we see that, yet again, it is Islamist organizations, extremist and fundamentalist, that are spearheading the continuing subjugation of women, of Muslims who don't conform to their particular interpretation of Islam, of gay people, of atheists and others. All across the Muslim world, we see these extremists promoting an anti-human rights agenda. Right now, of course, the most extreme manifestation of this is what is happening in Iraq and Syria at the hands of the Islamic State. We've all witnessed those horrific scenes of the siege of Kobani in northern Syria by the ISIS forces. This is a struggle for democracy and secularism against clerical fascism. I don't think the Kurds are perfect, but they have established a democratic secular quasi-state in northern Syria. There is broad equality and human rights. Not perfect by a long shot with regards to women or gay people, but much better than any of the surrounding Muslim state actors. To me, it is extraordinary that people in the West have done so little to help those Kurdish people who are resisting the Islamic State. I know there's great resistance to go to war, and I would not support the intervention of Western troops, nor even Western airstrikes. I think to go down that road would play into the hands of Islamist extremists. They would characterize Western intervention as a new crusade. It would give them the ideological ammunition to portray this as a titanic battle, ISIS versus the West, ISIS versus Western imperialism. Far better, I think, to aid the Kurdish democratic and secular defenders, to empower them to defeat ISIS. That would be a much more secure and damning victory. And right now, we know the Kurds want and need heavy weapons to match those of ISIS, military training to use the new weapons, communications equipment, military intelligence to identify the ISIS positions so they can be targeted, plus food and medical supplies. Now, I do not like war. I am very reluctant to endorse any armed conflict. But when you are facing a force so evil as ISIS, it's like Nazism. We had to go to war to defeat the Third Reich. Liberty and democracy were at stake. And that is how the Kurdish people see it. They are not fighting a war of aggression or offense. Theirs is a self-defensive war to defend their democratic, secular quasi-state against the clerical fascism of ISIS. And I despair that the world community is not rallying to support those brave, heroic Kurdish defenders. Why can't the British government, or indeed governments anywhere, provide an airdrop into Kobane? Weapons, medical supplies, food, ammunition. That's what the Kurdish people are crying out for. That can make the difference. In my view, we should be empowering the Kurdish resistance to defeat ISIS and liberate themselves. Not go in marching as a new Western savior or a new version of Western imperialism, but go there purely to provide aid so that they can liberate themselves. What is happening, of course, in Iraq and Syria is just a microcosm of what is happening in many parts of the Islamic world. In so many countries, we see targeted sectarian murders, Muslim on Muslim. People are deemed by fundamentalists to not be sufficiently good Muslims. They are declared infidels, kuffars, and subjected to an horrendous fate. If we look at Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, and many other states where Islam has political power, we see that it goes hand in hand with the suppression of equality and human rights. And as I said, so often the victims are fellow Muslims. The Sufi Muslims, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, are universally despised by the majority of other Muslims. And we see bizarre situations where a Shia Muslim-dominated state like Iran persecutes Sunni Muslims. Conversely, in Saudi Arabia, a Sunni Muslim state persecutes the Shias. Too often in this whole issue, we forget the prime victims of Islamism are Muslim people. Muslim people who are deemed to have the wrong kind of Islam. Of course, it doesn't just happen over there. Some of you may recall that earlier this year, the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Luton placed an advert in their local newspaper celebrating, I think there was 150 years of their presence in the Luton community. Everybody thought this was great, except for mainstream Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims who regard the Ahmadiyyas as apostates and infidels. They protested to the Luton paper, I think it was the Luton Advertiser, and forced it to give an apology for carrying the advert. The newspaper caved in and gave an apology for carrying an advert celebrating the contribution of Ahmadiyya Muslims to Luton and to Britain. So you get the drift. Of course, there are far worse things happening elsewhere. We're all familiar with Boko Haram in Nigeria. Not just the kidnapping of those schoolgirls who have disappeared, but also the many school massacres, where students and teachers have been shot to death or burned alive in Boko Haram raids upon their schools, because they believe that education is a Western value and is anti-Islamic. But if we look overall at this kind of religious infighting, it's argued by some researchers that probably it is Christians who on a global scale are now the most persecuted, usually at the hands of extreme Islamists. So, for example, we saw the shocking bombing of the church in Peshawar in Pakistan, where I think nearly 100 people were killed coming out of the church. That's just one of many, many instances. In Pakistan today, Pakistan, with whom we have cordial diplomatic relations, which is a member of the Commonwealth, Christians are at risk of being murdered in their homes, in the street, and their workplaces. Christian shops are often vandalized or firebombed. Christian churches are being burned down and ransacked. And the Pakistani state sits back and does little or nothing. You may have heard of the case of Asia Bibi, a Christian Pakistani woman who allegedly made some innocent remark which some Muslims took as blasphemy. She was put on trial, this mother, a peasant woman from a small village, a mother of several children, put on trial and convicted of blasphemy and sentenced to death. She's been on death row for years. Her recent appeal was due to be heard. And yet again, the appeal was postponed because the judge was too terrified to come to court in case the extremists came and killed him. Which has happened to judges, lawyers, and human rights defenders who have stood by people accused or even falsely accused of so-called blasphemy. So this poor woman can't have her appeal heard because the judges in Pakistan are too terrified. To their credit, most of these judges do not want to uphold the death sentence, but they fear the consequences for themselves and their families if they do not. So they just don't appear at court. So she's still languishing all these years on death row. In the Central African Republic, in recent months, in the last year or so, we've seen intercommunal violence between Christians and Muslims. Of course, it isn't just about religion. The same way as in Nigeria, the violence between Christians and Muslims in the north is not just about religion. It's also partly about land and ownership of resources, access to water. But religion underpins it, and religion is being used to justify it. In Sri Lanka and in Burma, Buddhist extremists have been instrumental in attacking Muslims. I'm sure many of you are aware of the plight of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma who have been driven out of the country. They are stateless, not recognized. They're suffering incredible persecution, including violent riots where their homes are torched and many of them have been murdered. So overall, when I look at the role that organized religion is playing around the world in all these different places, and I look at all these different faiths, this is why I'm a humanist. I think a humanist understanding based on scientific knowledge, empirical evidence, reason, and human rights is a better way to understand the world than one informed by religious dogma and superstition. Humanists don't need a God or a holy text to tell us what is right and what is wrong. We know that murder is wrong. We know that discriminating against other people is wrong. That can be concluded through a rational process of reasoning. That if we allow discrimination, all of us are somehow diminished. Not just the victims, but all of us as a society. If you want an inclusive society, a caring, compassionate society, we can achieve that without the need for God or religion. It's also, of course, why I am a secularist. Now, secularism is often misunderstood as anti-clericalism. Secularism is not anti-religious. It's simply calling for a separation of religion from the state. Religion is for individuals. It's a private matter. The state is for everyone without discrimination. When you have a secular society, when no religion is privileged, when no religion is established, you create a legal level playing field where people of all faiths and none have the same rights and responsibilities, where religious minorities are protected. And that's the great irony. If you're religious, you ought to support secularism because it ensures that whatever your faith may be, you will not be disadvantaged. The state will not give one religion or one interpretation of religion privileged access and legal status. As I mentioned earlier, in Iran, a Shia-dominated state, where Shia Islam is part of the state structure, the only country apart from Britain which has clerics in the parliament as of right, unelected. In Iran, that privileging means that minority faiths, Zoroastrians, Sunni Muslims, Sufi Muslims, Ahmadiyya Muslims, Christians and others, are legally disadvantaged. We look at Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator. I'm glad he's gone. But what has replaced him has been a scale of religious sectarianism unseen during Saddam's rule. the post-war settlement in Iraq brought to power the Shia majority under Nouri al-Maliki. It brought to the fore Shia Islamist militias who went around murdering Sunni Muslims, gay people, unveiled women, young people listened to Western pop music, girls with Western-style haircuts or who were not wearing the hijab, sellers of alcohol, bookshops selling Western books. These were the victims of the Shia death squads, which have been going on ever since 2003. And yet Western governments, for the most part, until very recently, were supporting the Nouri al-Maliki regime, where these death squads were embedded in government ministries. And of course, that is part of the reason, not the whole reason, but part of the reason why ISIS has gained power. Because ISIS has appealed to the sense of grievance and persecution that Sunni Muslims found themselves suffering in Iraq post-Saddam. ISIS may not have been their first choice, but ISIS was seen by many of them as defending their communities and faith against the Shia-dominated discrimination and death squads. I mentioned that Iran, together with Britain, has the honor of being the only two countries in the world where clerics sit as of right in the parliament. We have 26 Church of England bishops sitting in the House of Lords, unelected, unaccountable, simply because they represent the established church. So even here in Britain, although we are largely a secular society, we're not entirely. The Church of England is the established state religion. The Church of England has its bishops in the House of Lords as a right, unlike any other religion or any other focus or lobby group in our society. We also, of course, have given the Church of England special exemptions from our equality laws. In fact, not just the Church of England, but all religious bodies in Britain have limited qualified exemptions from the laws which guarantee equality. So, for example, when the legislation was passed to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, when that law was passed, religious bodies were given an opt-out, that they are still entitled to refuse to hire someone, or they can sack someone, because of their sexuality, if it conflicts with the organization's, quote, religious ethos. Equally, they can refuse to provide services to clients if their sexuality or gender identity is deemed to be in conflict with the religious ethos. These exemptions don't just apply to religious organizations like churches, mosques, synagogues, or temples. They also apply to faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless, and so on. They all have these exemptions. They're written into all the equality laws. Now, my view is, I don't agree with religion, but I will defend the right of people of faith to hold their point of view. What I can't accept is their right to discriminate and their seized right, now enshrined in law, to be exempt from the equality laws and responsibilities that apply to everyone else. Why should faith be exempt? Why should, just because you hold a religious point of view, should you be allowed to evade the equality laws that are incumbent upon every other citizen? I don't think that's right. You'll all be familiar with the case of the Christian bed and breakfast owners who turned away a gay couple because they felt that homosexuality was against their faith. Well, I'm very sad and disappointed, but they are entitled to hold that misguided, prejudiced view in a free society. I wish they wouldn't, but they are entitled to hold that view. What they're not entitled to do is to put it into action by discriminating. That's a step too far. And now, of course, they say, oh, we as Christians are being discriminated against. We're persecuted because we can't discriminate against gay people. The law has ruled that to deny a gay couple a place in a publicly run and advertised bed and breakfast is against the law. Now, to me, I think that's really strange how the perpetrators of discrimination now claim to be the victims. They want the right to discriminate. And many people in the major faiths do support them. They endorse that view. They think that because of their faith, they should have a right to discriminate against people they object to, whether it be people of a different sexual orientation or a different faith. Thankfully, the law so far has said no. You are offering a public service. It is your duty to provide that public service without discrimination. Some of you will be familiar with the Islamist Global Peace and Unity Conference, which takes place in London usually every year. Now, of course, there are many fine speakers at these conferences in recent years. Many people I had no objection. In fact, even in some cases, I quite applaud them. But there were some speakers who endorsed an extreme Islamist point of view, including advocating killing gay people, women who have sex outside of marriage, Muslims who turn away from their faith, apostates, or indeed what they might call more liberal, moderate Muslims who don't share their particular hardline interpretation. Now, of course, it was bad enough that they were holding this conference. What was even worse was that it was endorsed by the police and the Mayor of London and a succession of Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat MPs. Unbelievable. It's like they're endorsing a BNP conference. These Islamists are worse than the BNP. I oppose the BNP and its predecessor, the National Front, and the English Defence League and all those other far-right groups like Britain First. They are nasty, extremist political fanatics who do not support universal human rights. But the Islamists are far worse. The Islamists are far, far worse. Objectionable though the BNP may be, and thankfully it looks like it's in its death throes, objectionable though the BNP may be, certainly the leadership and prominent people within it do not advocate killing other human beings. In fact, I'm not sure that any of their leaders, like Nick Griffin, odious though he is, ever advocated killing other human beings. But these Islamist preachers do and have. And yet, when they spoke at a conference, that conference was endorsed by the police, by MPs from all the main parties, and by others who you would think ought to know better. I am, of course, not a gayist. I'm not solely concerned with gay rights. I don't see gay rights as the be-all and end-all, the spectrum to which every human rights issue must be judged. But I do think it's important to note that here in Britain, during the long process of homosexual law reform, every reform that was proposed was resisted and condemned by religious leaders. Every single gay law reform since 1999 was opposed by religious leaders. They wanted to maintain discrimination. And I'm talking about Christian leaders, the Catholic Church, the Church of England. I'm talking about Orthodox Judaist leaders. I'm talking about the Muslim organizations like the Muslim Council of Britain. These are supposedly mainstream religious organizations, yet collectively and individually, they oppose an equal age of consent. They oppose lifting the ban on gay people serving in the armed forces. They oppose the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children. They oppose civil partnerships. They opposed laws protecting gay people against discrimination in the workplace. They opposed the repeal of Section 28. They opposed the ending of criminalization of same-sex relationships. And of course, most recently, they opposed same-sex marriage. And can you remember the kinds of scenarios they trumped out? They said same-sex marriage will lead to parents marrying their children, fathers marrying their sons, people marrying their dogs. This was truly sickening and bizarre. But the fact that they were prepared to say those kind of things, and these weren't just the backwoods, fringe extremists. Some of these quite extreme views came from people fairly high up in the religious hierarchies. What I found so gratifying was that despite their attempt to derail same-sex marriage, the religious leaders' attempt to derail same-sex marriage, 55% of people of faith in Britain supported same-sex civil marriage in register offices. So quite clearly, the leaderships of the Christian, Jewish Orthodox, and Islamist organizations were out of touch with the majority of their followers. And that's really heartening. I think we should always remember that. To reinforce my earlier point, there are good people of faith. There are some people of faith who stand with us for universal equality and human rights. I mentioned earlier that I would, of course, although I disagree with religion, I would defend the right of religious people to hold their point of view. And a good example of that is the case of Harry Hammond, who you may remember about 10 or more years ago, held up a sign in public in Bournemouth saying, "Stop homosexuality, stop lesbianism." Now, these are not views that I obviously endorse. I was very saddened that he should hold that point of view and parade it in public. But of course, as a Democrat, as someone who believes in civil liberties for everyone, I felt compelled to defend his right to make his point. Harry Hammond was, of course, arrested and eventually convicted under the public order laws. I found that a step too far. I certainly supported those who protested against him, but to criminalize him for merely saying, "Stop homosexuality, stop lesbianism," that's too far. He wasn't threatening or menacing anyone. He wasn't using an aggressive, menacing tone. He was expressing a point of view that I happen to regard as misguided. But if we are to live in a free society, we sometimes have to put up with views that we find offensive. When I say put up with, we shouldn't accept them, we shouldn't let them pass unchallenged, but I don't think we should go down the road of persecution or criminalization. So I was prepared to go to court to testify in Harry Hammond's right to free speech. Sadly, he was so homophobic, he didn't want me to defend him. I think that's a good example of just how sad it is that some people of faith not only have bigoted views, but even when someone is prepared to defend their right to hold those views, would rather suffer the punishment that he ultimately suffered, which was a conviction and a fine. I can't remember what the fine was. But in my view, as I said, that was not compatible with a free and democratic society. Looking at bigger fish, so to speak, we all know the role of the Anglican leadership in so many of these issues. The Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, I suppose, personifies this. He is the second most senior person in the Church of England. Yet he is on record as opposing equal rights for all, and he endorses the idea that religious discrimination should be enshrined in law, particularly when it comes to the human rights of LGBT people. So he opposed same-sex marriage very strongly. What he was really doing was advocating the interference of the Church of England into the civil law. He was saying that laws concerning civil marriages in register offices should be subject to a veto by the Church of England. The Church of England should have the right to veto that legislation, even though it was just entirely concerned with civil ceremonies in register offices. Nothing to do with religious marriages whatsoever. So he argued very strongly that the Church should oppose it, that believers should oppose it, that the state itself should oppose same-sex civil marriage. And of course, he came initially quite close to succeeding. What was interesting is that over time, more and more people of faith and of no faith began to see through that argument and recognize that whatever the Archbishop's beliefs, he did not have a right to foist and impose upon the rest of society. But what he did, of course, secure, together with Justin Welby and others, was the so-called quadruple lock, where we have same-sex civil marriage, but it is now unlawful for the Church of England and the Church of Wales, as the two established churches, it is now unlawful for them to conduct same-sex religious marriages if they want to, or even if they want to. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that under the same-sex marriage legislation, there was a clause which said that religious organizations can conduct same-sex religious marriages if they wish to. They can opt in voluntarily, except for the Church of England and the Church of Wales. And that was a position, an exemption, an exclusive privilege protection that John Sentamu, Justin Welby and others fought for. To me, that quadruple lock is not only homophobic, it's also an attack upon religious freedom, which the two archbishops colluded with and supported. Because what the law is now saying is, even if the Church of England and the Church of Wales subsequently, at some point in the future, decide they want to have same-sex religious marriages, they are prohibited by law from doing so. That is an attack upon religious freedom. More recently, you may be aware that the Archbishop of York has gone along with the disciplinary action being taken against a local priest in Nottinghamshire, Jeremy Pemberton. Jeremy Pemberton married his lifelong partner, Lawrence Cunnington. And for this terrible, terrible, despicable deed, the Bishop of Nottingham and Southwell, Richard Inwood, acting on the advice of the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, has withdrawn his right to officiate as a priest and denied him even a license to be a chaplain in the NHS with Sherwood Trust hospitals. So you could sort of say it's one thing for him to say he can't be a priest in a Church of England church. It's another thing to say that when the National Health Service, which is bound by equality laws, wants to have him as a priest, the Archbishop of York steps in, or Richard Inwood steps in after taking advice from the Archbishop of York and says no, he cannot have a license to be a chaplain for the Sherwood NHS Trust. This is now going to an employment tribunal.
So do you happen to know whether or not the NHS is employing this independently?
Could I come? Okay, I'll answer that now, but if we can just leave the questions till later, that's fine. The NHS has withdrawn its offer on the grounds that it says people who work for the NHS have to have a license as a clergy person from the relevant religious authority. So in a sense, the NHS has colluded with the discrimination perpetrated by the Church of England. John Sentamu has some considerable form. Some of you may have heard about the terrible case of the murder of Damilola Taylor in South London. John Sentamu was in charge of an inquiry or a report into Damilola Taylor's murder. And he produced quite a thick volume going into minute detail about that whole case, including detailed descriptions of the streets, the street lighting, every little minutiae of detail. What was totally absent from that report was the fact that 3 days before his murder, Damilola Taylor was homophobically abused, threatened, and assaulted. He'd been subjected to weeks of harassment and victimization and bullying by homophobic people at school and in the community. Now, you would think that would be quite a relevant factor in detailing the history of the case. You think that would be quite significant. But John Sentamu decided not. The street lighting was a very relevant factor, but the fact that this poor young boy had been a victim of homophobic bullying in the weeks prior to his death, and the possibility that his murderers may have been the same homophobic bullies, was not even considered in his report. As you may well know, John Sentamu is originally from Uganda. You would think that having that connection, he might have spoken out against the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which threatened the death penalty for gay people. Well, if he did, very few people heard his words. And certainly in Uganda, the people I asked, they say, oh no, we have never heard a word from the Archbishop of York condemning this legislation. So I tend to call him the arch-bigot of York. Perhaps rather childish and mildly abusive, but I think he deserves it. So I think the Archbishop sums up how, even in Britain, religious leaders are prepared to go along with the denial of human rights. How they're willing to seek, even in this day and age, to impose their theological will upon others, regardless of whether they believe or not. And so for all these different reasons and all these different examples, I think there is an arguable case that organised religion is the single greatest threat to human rights globally. We see abuses sanctioned or colluded with in this country and so many countries by religious leaders of all different faiths. I think we need to remind those religious leaders that, without getting into a textual tit for tat, the essence of most faiths is supposed to be about love and compassion. And that is not compatible with the abuse of human rights. As I always say, discrimination is not a religious value. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. As an Anglo-Palestinian myself, I can see all sorts of situations in the Middle East today between the Palestinians and the Israelis, which when all the boiling and all the fighting is distilled down, it also boils down to a question of human rights. My question really is there in your mind a state or a social order anywhere that in the spectrum of adherence to human rights is perhaps the leading light, if you like, the ones that have got the best record on human rights? And what would you attribute that to?
I think the simple answer is no, I don't have any model state that's got it all right. I think there are some states that have got it better than others. And I would say that despite whatever flaws there may be, most Western nations tend to have established a more secular state where there is a greater separation between religion and the state, and where human rights and the rights of religious minorities are better respected than in many others. But as I gave the examples from here in Britain, even a country like ours is not flawless or perfect. We've moved in the right direction, and compared to many countries around the world, we are, some considerably way better when it comes to respecting human rights and equality for all. I think that one of the reasons for that, but not the entire reason, is the increasing de-religiousization of our societies. The church no longer holds such great sway. And perhaps even a better example than Britain is just across the water in Ireland. For decades, if not centuries, held under the sway of the Catholic hierarchy. Now we see little Ireland emerging in so many positive ways in defense of human rights. In terms of equality laws, just this very week, a poll has been released which shows that when there is the referendum on same-sex marriage in Ireland next year, judging by the current polls, it's going to be an absolute landslide victory for marriage equality. And that's an enormous positive achievement by a small nation, only really, 2 or 3 decades at the most, out of the grips of, a very harsh Catholic fundamentalism. So I think a decline in religious belief, the decreasing hold that religious bodies have had on the populations in Western countries is in part to do with that greater respect for individual liberty, human rights and equality. But having said that, even supposedly secular states like the United States, where the Constitution, the Bill of Rights enshrines a separation, they have "In God We Trust" written on their banknotes. And of course, religious people, have been able to sway many legislators to oppose same-sex marriage, women's reproductive rights, stem cell research, and so on. So, the Western example is not flawless. Anybody else? And don't forget, you can ask a question, but if you disagree, feel free to come back at me, and we want to hear your different points of view, so we can have a dialogue, a discussion.
Okay.
Peter, I thought your survey of the major religions was masterful, and particularly glad you included the Buddhists who tend to get an easy ride on these issues. You left out the Hindus, and I think with Modi coming to power in India, the rise of Hindu extremism and Hindu power there is quite frightening. I just wondered what you thought about it.
About the rise of Hindu nationalism, and in particular the attacks upon Muslim people by those extremists. And of course, Modi, the Indian leader, is himself implicated in the attacks and massacres of Muslim people over a decade ago. So I think Hinduism is not beyond reproach, nor is Sikhism, nor many other, of the smaller globally minority faiths. I think that wherever religion has state power or influence, it is often implicated in human rights abuses.
Hi. I'm concerned about education and religion. I remember very much what sectarian religion education was like in Scotland. I was sent to a Catholic school. Northern Ireland was and still is as bad. I was appalled at the way that people fell over themselves and say, what a nice man Dr. Paisley had been when he died. He was not a nice man. For 60 years of his life, he was not a nice man. He did not represent a major organised religion. He made up his own church. But he lived off vile, popularist prejudice against another group. What can we do in our education system to actually educate people about education and how false most of the great religious books actually are? Most of them were made up at least 200 years after the death of the main prophets. What can we do about religious education in this country, and perhaps to show a shining example to the rest of the world? Oh, and include humanism in that.
Well, of course, I think one of the principles of a good society is that we have a high-quality education system that does not divide young people based on class or race or faith. I'm a great believer in the principle of a comprehensive education system, a coeducational comprehensive system where everyone is educated together, whatever their background. Of course, not always has the comprehensive system worked out well, which is one of the reasons why faith schools have been able to survive and in some cases thrive. But I think the principle should be that any form of sectarian education, however light, is not a good principle. If you want to have an inclusive society where people learn to understand each other, to experience the other within, to acknowledge diversity, young people need to be educated together. And of course, it's quite right and proper that that education should include education about religion, because religion has been a major impact upon global history. But it shouldn't be to the exclusion of atheism, humanism, and the non-believing systems, the non-religious systems. And I think one of the problems with religious education in this country is some schools do give education in humanist ethics and humanist values, but not many. For most, it is very much about the three great Abrahamic faiths, to the exclusion of all others. I think it's very regrettable the way in which faith schools are funded by the state. If people want to educate their children in a faith school, then part of me thinks, well, perhaps they should be allowed to do it, even though it goes against my principle of inclusive education. But certainly I don't think the state should be funding these schools or providing them with tax breaks as charitable status bodies. I think charitable status should be withdrawn from faith schools, and ultimately they should be phased out. The very sad thing is that it was largely under a Labour government that there was this huge explosion of faith schools. And of course we now have not only faith schools but academies and free schools, introduced more recently. These are all different forms of sectarian education. And we've seen the way in which some of these free schools have been exposed for teaching religious extremism and indoctrinating pupils. Although it's probably fairly small, given the range of free schools, independent schools, faith schools, and academies, it's still quite worrying. And it's also very worrying that some of the academies, which are getting private finance, teach creationism, a completely bogus idea that has no scientific validity or evidence for it. It seems to me extraordinary that in the 21st century, young people are being taught that creationism is a valid alternative to evolution. And even if you take the critical view that evolution hasn't got all the answers, it's just because we haven't discovered them. It's not because it's flawed as such. The evidence is overwhelming. So I think that education is about preparing for young people for adult life. And that is best done in an inclusive education system that is non-sectarian, not religious, and which recognizes the diversity in our society and does not brook any form of discrimination. What's truly extraordinary about the Equality Act of 2010, which in principle was one of the great achievements of recent government, the Equality Act ended the hodgepodge of separate equality laws. We used to have a system of laws for women's rights, black and ethnic minority rights, gay and lesbian rights, disability rights, the rights of elderly people and young people, and so on. Now they're all brought together within a single legal framework, the Equality Act 2010. It's created a level playing field where all forms of equality and all forms of discrimination are treated in law equally. That's a really, really good, important advance, because in the old days you had this fragmentation of the equality agenda, where race equality, although not perfect, was the most effective and most legally strong, then followed by women's equality, and then further down the line, way down, you had much more limited restrictive laws governing discrimination based on age, sexuality, gender identity, and religion or belief. Now, the Equality Act is a good thing, but written into it are these religious exemptions, and including for schools. In the section on the Equality Act, which talks about the duty, the public duty for no discrimination in the school system, it says in a subclause, these protections against discrimination shall not apply on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. In other words, according to the Equality Act, faith organizations, faith schools, have a qualified right to discriminate against LGBT staff and pupils. That cannot be right. That cannot be right in a democratic modern society. The first part, what to do about it, exactly what you did. Challenge it, question it. And that can be by making direct overtures to the head of the school, but also perhaps taking it to the school governors, and also raising it with the local member of parliament or the local member of the European Parliament or your local councillors. I don't know whether you'd get any joy from them, but certainly that's the way to go. The important thing is to question it and challenge it. And it is sad that, within the education system, particularly under the Conservative-led government, schools are given more leeway when it comes to these issues. Faith schools are allowed to teach ideas that are consistent with their religious ethos. So, for example, when it comes to sex and relationship education, although it's been largely gutted by the current government, there are still fragments of it there, but it's very clear that faith schools have been given a license by this government that, yes, they should teach, the secular standard, issues and values around sex and relationship education, but they're also allowed to teach their own religious ethos when it comes to sex and relationships, which, of course, for the most of the major faith schools, homosexuality is immoral, sinful, unnatural, abnormal. In some religions, of course, women are still deemed to be inferior and subordinate to men. We see that very clearly in the ban on women priests in the Catholic Church, and until recently, the ban on women bishops in the Church of England. So I think challenging it and taking it to the school governors and raising it publicly, because this is these schools don't like bad publicity, because they fear that if they're challenged and if they're exposed, this may affect their future recruitment, that parents will be turned off and they will therefore lose pupils. So I think you did absolutely the right thing, but I would say make it public. Go to the local press, go to your MP, and go to the school governors. The second part of the question is, why does the government collude with faith schools and these exemptions? I think it is in part to do with David Cameron's big society idea. The idea that functions of the state can be hived off to voluntary organizations or non-governmental bodies like religious organizations. It helps the idea of a smaller state if education or part of education is being taken over and done by a religious body or by an independent academy. That fits with the idea of slimming down the state and reducing its commitment. I think also there are votes in it, or there are deemed to be votes in it. Political parties, particularly Labour and the Conservatives, have reasoned that there are block votes out there, that Christians, Jews, Muslims and others have votes. And if it can appeal to their religious sensibilities, maybe those votes will come to them as a party. So I think it's quite cynical, quite opportunist, and quite wrong.
Hiya. You spoke about evangelical religion in America. I don't know if you're aware, but coming to Plymouth soon is God TV. So we've got like a cinema complex which is being built, and I think it's being opened next year. And the council said it's wonderful because it creates a few jobs and bring thousands of people to the city. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on what impact it could have on Plymouth.
Well, in terms of bringing jobs to Plymouth, I'd be very interested to know how many jobs it's actually created. I suspect very few. Maybe a couple of camera people and a presenter and some secretarial office backup. That's probably about it. And I think I was also, I'm going to say surprised, but perhaps not surprised, that the very moralistic CEO of God TV not long ago had to resign for unnamed moral failings. Whatever they were, I think it just reinforces the idea that so often religious leaders who set themselves up as paragons of religious virtue often themselves fall short. I mean, I've lost track of the number of American televangelists who've been caught out with extramarital affairs, male and female prostitutes, porn rings, and so on. It's unbelievable, the number of them who have been caught out as not practicing what they preach. And I think, of course, there's a role for ethics and morality, but when it becomes moralizing and restrictive in the way these televangelists and God channels do it, it often hides something quite sinister and quite hypocritical. I can remember my parents, bless them, they are borderline Christian fundamentalists. They used to adore Billy Graham and Oral Roberts. And I was, as a kid, always say to them, well, it's all very fine that you follow these people, but are they actually following the teachings of Jesus? You know, these people, in the name of religion, have amassed fabulous personal wealth. Unbelievable, multiple mansions. They lead a fleet of cars and private jets. They lead a luxurious lifestyle. They're making money out of gullible people like you. I think eventually, after probably 3 decades, my parents got the message and saw through it. But I think it does say quite something, the way in which so many of these religious leaders, particularly the evangelical Protestant ones, are using religion as a money-making exercise for their own personal aggrandizement. And, there was this whole strand of Christianity called prosperity Christianity. It's very big in the United States, it's big in Nigeria. You've got these religious leaders, these Christian leaders who promise, if you turn to God and support our church, if you give to the church, you'll receive from God many times more in riches. It's an appeal to naked greed. And whatever you think about religion, I don't see that in the recorded teachings of Jesus Christ as being a Christian value.
Thank you. Peter, it's been very interesting. Peter, where would you advise humanists and humanist groups like this one, where would you direct our efforts to try and improve the situation?
To what?
To try and improve the situation.
Okay. Well, I think unlike religious people, I think humanists tend to hide their light under a bushel, if I may be biblical. Where we're not so good at actually promoting the ideas and presenting a sort of a friendly, open public space. I mean, here tonight we are, and that's great and fantastic, and I salute the work of local humanist groups. But I think it's important that we do more than that. And I think I was really pleased to hear you say that you do education work in schools. And it's great that you've got some access to some schools. That's a really important way of giving an alternative point of view, opening young people's minds to a different system of belief, a belief not based upon holy text or dogma or superstition. I think we need to keep referring to the frequent failings of religion. Failings in terms of upholding the values they espouse, failings in terms of adherence to equality and human rights. But we also, I think, need to make sometimes common cause with people of faith who are committed to similar values. I do not take the view that just because someone is religious they can be dismissed or their opinions don't count. I think some of the strongest allies in the battle for LGBT rights have been religious leaders. You think of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, great icon of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, who's spoken out time and time and time again against homophobia, comparing it to racism. He said that he did not fight against apartheid to create a society where any section of the community suffered discrimination. For him, the struggle for freedom in South Africa was a struggle for all South Africans, regardless of faith or race, sexuality or any other issue. And that message, I think, is the message of an ally who we can work with. And we may disagree about religion. We may disagree with the superstitious and dogmatic elements of it. But at the end of the day, what's ultimately most important is actions. How does faith impact in the real world on people's lives? So religious people do, often motivated by their faith, many good works in the community, many charitable works here and around the world. And I salute that. That's fantastic. Of course, so do non-believers. I mentioned the Humanist schools in Uganda. That's an example of a non-religious charitable work that is doing really important work to enhance and improve young people's lives. So I think it's about making common cause as well as challenging those who do abuse their faith to deny others the equality and human rights they deserve.
Hi Peter. We've talked about a lot of really sad, quite depressing stuff tonight. I was just wondering, what is there to be optimistic about with this stuff, in your opinion?
You're absolutely right. It was quite a depressing roll call of religious-inspired abuses around the world. I think it's important to acknowledge those. We need to know what is happening in order to know how we overcome it and move forward. But I didn't mean to give you all a state of nervous anxiety and depression about the way in which the world is going. It's true, there is a religious revival in many countries. We see it in our own country, the way in which religion now has privileged access to government. Beginning with Tony Blair, religious leaders were invited to Downing Street. They were given the right to access and even veto over social policy in a way that human rights organizations were never given. But my response to that is we need to also demand a place at the table. We need to say that governments ought to consider the views of human rights and civil liberties groups when framing policy, that we ought to have access and be consulted. I think also we need to remember that despite this religious revival in many countries, overall, the long-term trend is a decline in religious belief. That's the overall historic trend. And not only a decline in religious belief, but a decline in the political and social power of religion, as I mentioned, for example, in Ireland. So that's a cause for hope and optimism. I think also the fact that so many people of faith do not share the often intolerant, bigoted views of their leaders is a cause for hope. And I said, when I saw that poll that found that 55% of people of faith in Britain supported same-sex civil marriage, despite the opposition of their leaders, I thought, people of faith are capable of compassion and reason and dissent from what their leaders say. So I'm sort of depressed and pessimistic when I see, ISIS and other religious fanatics, causing murder and mayhem. But I'm also inspired that there are so many people around the world who are challenging that. And I, look at a country like Iran, which is under the yoke of a theocratic regime which has been in power since 1979, and has done terrible, terrible, terrible things. Yet I know that within Iran, despite this incredible repression, there are millions of people who want an end to the Islamic State. They want a secular state. They want a state that respects human rights. And although they are cowed at the moment, by a police state regime, ultimately in the end, they will win. It may take time. It may take time. But I always think of the example of the Third Reich. Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted all of 12 years. Well, the Islamic regime in Iran has lasted considerably longer than 12 years. But it too will have its fall. No tyranny lasts forever. Ultimately, reason, rationality, humanity, and human rights does prevail. My thanks to all of you coming here tonight, and I'm sure you've heard some of my stories and views, but I'm sure around this hall, many of you are engaged in social movements and activism to promote equality and human rights. And it is our collective effort that makes the change. I don't make the change, no organization makes the change, it's the collectivity of our communities that makes the change. So if we work together, if we're determined and passionate, if we only contribute small, but if we make a contribution of some sort, ultimately we will make those positive changes. So I just remind everyone, please take a flyer about my human rights organization. On the back it tells you how to sign up for email bulletins, Facebook and Twitter. We're a very small NGO. There's only 2 of us at the moment, but we work in Britain and around the world. About half the work is on LGBT issues, about half the rest is on women's rights, ethnic minority rights, religious freedom, free speech, challenges to religious fundamentalism. We support activists in many different countries who are fighting this fight. So please take one and sign up, and we don't get any organised funding. If you're in a position to make a donation, please consider that. Maybe you can't, but maybe you know someone who can. Please take a leaflet for them, because we depend entirely on donations from well-wishers to do our work. But once again, thanks to you and good luck in the work you're doing here in Plymouth.